For years, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, has walked a very fine line in Ukraine. The alliance's core mission is to protect its own members, and Ukraine is not yet a member. This means NATO has avoided sending its own soldiers into the fight. Doing so would turn a regional war into a direct conflict between the world's largest military alliance and Russia, a nation with thousands of nuclear weapons. Instead, NATO's strategy has been to help Ukraine defend itself. This has been a massive undertaking designed to give Ukraine the tools it needs to fight for its own survival without pulling NATO directly into the war. The support from NATO countries has been substantial, a lifeline for Ukraine's military. Since February 2022, individual member states have poured over 144 billion euros into military aid alone. This includes everything from advanced missile systems and tanks to basic supplies like ammunition and medical kits. The United States has been the single largest contributor, but European allies have also stepped up significantly, providing billions in financial and military assistance. This support is not just about equipment, it's also about knowledge. NATO has established critical hubs, like the NCTU Center in Germany, to coordinate this flow of aid and train Ukrainian soldiers on how to use complex Western weapons systems. This entire support structure is carefully built to operate from outside Ukraine's borders. For instance, the Joint Analysis, Training and Education Center, which opened in Poland in early 2025, allows Ukrainian and NATO officers to share vital lessons learned from the battlefield. They study Russian tactics, analyze the effectiveness of different defense strategies, and develop new ways to protect critical infrastructure from attack. This allows for real-time learning and adaptation, making Ukrainian forces more resilient and effective. But all of this happens on Allied territory, reinforcing the clear boundary that NATO has so far refused to cross. It is a policy of support, not direct participation. Despite this immense effort, the fundamental reason for not sending troops remains the same: the risk of a catastrophic escalation. Article 5 of the NATO treaty states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Because Ukraine is not a member, this collective defense clause does not apply. Sending NATO forces would essentially mean choosing to enter the war, making NATO a combatant under international law. This would instantly raise the stakes, creating a direct military confrontation with Russia. It is a scenario that leaders in Washington, Brussels, and other allied capitals have worked tirelessly to avoid, believing the potential consequences are simply too grave to contemplate. Imagine a different reality, one where the calculations change and NATO leaders decide that indirect support is no longer enough. The decision is made. NATO troops will be sent to Ukraine. This would be a monumental shift in global security, a crossing of a geopolitical Rubicon. The mission of these troops would be critical. They might not be sent to the front lines to fight Russian forces directly. Instead, their role could be to secure a specific part of western Ukraine, creating a safe zone. This would allow Ukrainian forces to move more of their own soldiers to the east, where the fighting is most intense. The NATO presence would act as a powerful deterrent. The arrival of the first NATO units on Ukrainian soil would send a powerful message to Moscow. It would signal that the West's commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty is now backed by military force on the ground. This could be a force led by European nations, an idea that has been discussed, particularly by France, as the United States has shown reluctance to commit its own troops for such a mission. A credible force, as some military analysts suggest, would need to be substantial, perhaps starting with 40,000 soldiers and involving up to 100,000 personnel when you include logistics and rotations. This would be a major military operation, unlike anything seen in Europe for decades. The deployment would likely happen in phases. The first troops might be assigned to protect major cities far from the front, like Lviv or Odessa, freeing up Ukrainian air defense systems to be used elsewhere. They could also secure key supply lines, ensuring that military and humanitarian aid can move freely and safely from the Polish border into the rest of the country. This would be a non-combat role in theory, but the risk of confrontation would hang over every patrol and every checkpoint. The soldiers would be operating in a country at war, where stray missiles or deliberate attacks could turn their mission into a combat situation in an instant. For the Ukrainian people, the sight of NATO flags on their territory could bring a profound sense of relief and hope. It would be a tangible sign that they are not alone and that the world's most powerful alliance is physically there to guarantee their nation's future. It could boost morale on the front lines and among civilians who have endured years of conflict. However, it would also bring a new level of tension. Every citizen would understand that their country had just become the central stage for a direct standoff between nuclear-armed powers, making the future even more uncertain and potentially more dangerous than before. The moment NATO troops set foot in Ukraine, the world would hold its breath waiting for Russia's reaction. From the Kremlin's perspective, this would be seen as a direct act of aggression, a confirmation of its long-stated fears of NATO encirclement. Russia would likely condemn the move in the strongest possible terms, framing it as an invasion and a declaration of war by the West. President Putin would almost certainly use the event to rally support at home, portraying Russia as a nation under siege and defending itself against a hostile alliance. This narrative would be pushed heavily through state-controlled media to justify whatever actions came next. The immediate military response from Russia is the most dangerous question. The Kremlin would face a critical choice: attack the newly arrived NATO forces and risk a full-scale war with the entire 32-nation alliance, or show restraint. A direct attack on NATO troops would trigger Article 5, potentially leading to a conflict that could escalate to nuclear levels. More likely, Russia might initially test NATO's resolve through other means. This could include launching missile strikes near NATO positions, engaging in aggressive cyber attacks against NATO countries, or using its air force to challenge NATO patrols in the skies over Ukraine, creating high-stakes incidents. Beyond direct military action, Russia would likely escalate the conflict in other domains. We could see an increase in hybrid warfare tactics across Europe, such as disinformation campaigns designed to sow division within NATO countries and turn public opinion against the intervention. Russia could also target critical infrastructure like undersea communication cables or energy pipelines to disrupt European economies. The goal would be to make the cost of intervention so high for NATO members that they would be forced to reconsider their deployment. The conflict would expand from the battlefields of Ukraine to become a continent-wide struggle. The risk of miscalculation would skyrocket. With Russian and NATO forces operating in such close proximity, the chances of an accident or a misunderstanding leading to a direct clash would be immense. A Russian missile going off course and hitting a NATO base, or a nervous commander on either side making the wrong call in a tense moment, could be the spark that ignites a much larger fire. This is the ultimate fear that has kept NATO troops out of Ukraine so far. The presence of those troops would create a permanent state of high alert across Europe, where the line between a fragile peace and a devastating war would become terrifyingly thin. Deploying troops to Ukraine would present enormous challenges for NATO countries, extending far beyond the immediate military risks. First, there is the sheer scale and cost of such an operation. A force of 40,000 to 100,000 soldiers would severely stretch the military resources of European nations. It would require a massive and sustained financial commitment at a time when many countries are already struggling to meet defense spending targets. In June 2025, NATO members agreed to a new goal of spending 3.5% of their GDP on defense, but even meeting the old 2% target was a challenge for many. This mission would demand even more. This financial pressure would force difficult conversations within governments and among the public. Leaders would have to justify spending billions more on defense while potentially cutting funding for social programs, healthcare, or education. For years, the United States has shouldered a disproportionate share of the alliance's defense burden. With the US insisting that Europe must take the lead on its own security, European nations would have to find the political will and the money to fund this massive undertaking themselves. This could create deep divisions within the alliance, as some countries might be unable or unwilling to contribute their fair share. Furthermore, the human cost cannot be ignored. Sending soldiers into a war zone, even in a theoretically non-combat role, means putting their lives at risk. Any casualties would have a profound impact back home, testing the public's support for the mission. Sustaining a long-term deployment would require a steady rotation of troops, placing immense strain on military families and the armed forces as a whole. Leaders would need to prepare their populations for the reality that this intervention could be long, costly, and dangerous, with no easy or quick exit strategy in sight. Ultimately, the decision to send NATO troops to Ukraine would be one of the most consequential choices in the alliance's history. It would represent a fundamental gamble that a direct military presence could deter further Russian aggression and force a path to a lasting peace, rather than trigger a wider, more catastrophic war. This choice would reshape the security architecture of Europe for generations. It highlights the incredibly difficult balance between supporting a partner nation's fight for freedom and managing the grave risks of a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. The search for peace in Ukraine is fraught with such monumental and perilous decisions.